On today's episode, we're doing a deep dive on agency profit. We're going to unpack gross margin, EBITDA, and why so many agency founders misunderstand what healthy numbers actually look like.
All right, Sewook. So today, we're going to be talking about a lot of agency finance stuff. For today's purposes, let's lay out what these definitions mean and how we're using them.
So the first thing we're going to be talking about quite a bit is gross margin. And we'll also use gross profit. And let's start with the difference between that. Gross margin is the percentage. Gross profit is the actual dollars. So when we define that from an agency perspective, it's the revenue that an agency receives or recognizes minus the cost that it is, cost of delivery. So delivery costs in an agency are typically labor. So client producing labor. So think about the full-time team members on your team that actually work towards delivering for your clients, freelancers that you might bring on for that client work as well. So it's all against what is that billable work that everyone is delivering against.
Let me just interject there because, all right, so let's just take the agency's doing $1 million, let's say, in revenue.
Yep.
And they kind of tally up all their costs at the end of the year, and they're like, all right, we spent $400,000 delivering the work to clients. Mm-hmm. What is gross margin? What is gross profit?
So that would be $1 million minus 400, so $600,000 as gross profit, and 60% as gross margin as a percentage. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Cool. And one big thing is this is an aggregate number. So oftentimes, we might hear, we have really high, gross margins on our projects. So what we're talking about here is not a engagement-based margin. So this isn't project margin. This isn't, specific to one engagement. This is an aggregate view of all of your revenue and all of your costs to deliver against that revenue.
Yeah. And usually we're looking at like a 12-month period, right? Like when we're typically talk about this. Yeah.
Yep. So just to kind of go a little bit deeper there is you can, scope things and really execute single engagements at a very high margin. So let's say you do one engagement with a client, you're like, wow, we killed it. We had like a 70% margin on that. But overall, your gross margin as a company can be low if you have low utilization. So if a lot of your team is sitting idle that you're still paying for, or other engagements that your team works on has a very low or potentially negative margin. So this is really focused on the aggregate view of all of the engagements and all the costs at a company.
Cool. All right. Next one, I'll take this one. EBITDA. So this is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. This is basically, the revenue minus the gross. And then, we also subtract, let's say, the, sales and marketing costs, the G&A, general administration costs, right? And then it's what's left there before. So this is like, and this is the key thing. There's like, you might have interest on a loan that you have to pay. That doesn't count here. You might have taxes you have to pay, obviously, on the profits. There might be some depreciation you're taking, or, just kind of the, any loan balance you're paying down. Like that doesn't count here. So this is all stuff that comes above that. And that's why EBITDA is an important number that really focuses on that operational efficiency.
Yeah. And important distinction here is it's different than net income, which might be referenced as well. And net income includes all the things that you just mentioned. And, oftentimes the things that really fluctuate there are taxes, depending on where you're located, region, geography, and how you even approach tax planning. And then if there are any extraordinary ownership distributions that could really fluctuate your net income number. So EBITDA is a nice normalized way to look at the health of a business.
Okay, great. So let's dive in. Let's talk first, going back to gross profit, right? Why is gross profit the starting point?
So gross profit, we can kind of look at it as it's really the funding source for the rest of the business. So when you look at everything else that you may want to invest in, like sales and marketing or building additional infrastructure through processes or R&D, if you really want to think about there's going to be volatility in your business where, there's highs and lows throughout the course of a time period. Gross margin and high gross margin gives you the ability to withstand all of that.
Yeah, definitely. And so let's talk about kind of, why is this so important then for agencies to start by anchoring their gross margin goals really high? Because, I think many times, and we've been guilty of this, like we hadn't even thought about it. And you're kind of like gross margin considerations come after, let's say a project, or like at the end of the year, you're like, oh, our margins were kind of, crappy. Like, and you kind of think about it in hindsight. But I think in order to really do it the right way, and we talk about this with our agencies these days as well, is you have to aim for a very high gross margin in the business. And, this could start at the engagement level, but ultimately you want that to bubble up to the aggregate. And so, yeah, let's talk about that. Like, why is this so important? And what is that? What is the number that, agencies should be aiming for?
Yeah. Maybe we'll start there. So from we have many agencies across Barrel Holdings, and what we typically see is anywhere from like a 40 to 60% gross margin number, depending on the company and what exactly they're delivering. The reason, why we try to encourage a high number there is it really helps create optionality at the company of, how can, without the gross margin, you don't have the money to invest in different areas. You can't invest in growth. It's really, we've been there where throughout the years where, when you're really squeezed at that level, you just end up making poor decisions later on.
Yeah. And, obviously, the AI is a big point of discussion these days, and the leverage you can get through that. And so, if you really lean into it and believe that AI can compress delivery time on tasks and just really automate certain aspects of delivery, you could, and if you're able to hold the price, margins should expand. And so, that's one factor, but, just in general, why is it important for agencies to, aim for beyond that? So, we talk about 40 to 60% for Barrel, but, that's at 40% is not great. Like we obviously want to see it higher than that. And so why is it that, software like margins, which could be 70 to 90%, why is that something that, we really, should aim for? And what are some things that can actually get an agency there?
Yeah, I think it's almost like we're always aiming higher. So if you even kind of bubble it up, like when you're scoping an engagement, it should be even higher than that, because you're bound to have, loss in utilization. There's going to be some rework. There's the realities of the business where if you shoot for 80%, you might land at 60% kind of thing. Yeah. So I think in general, you should always shoot a little bit higher to give yourself some buffer for all those things. But then, yeah, it really, if we think about how do you get there, and it starts with specialization and really having a differentiator that allows you to have some pricing power when it comes to relationships and engagements, where people will pay you for your expertise in a specific area and your experience there. And then over time, as you get more and more specialized and have that expertise, internally, you might have more productized services that are repeatable, that aren't exactly tied to the amount of time it takes to deliver on the work, and more about, it could be more about the results. And, you might develop even more IP to help you do that work internally faster. That, again, isn't tied to, you're not selling the time that you're spending on something. It's more, again, about the results or the products. And all of those kind of factors really help you get to that 70, 90% gross margins that, typically you see in software.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of it is because for so long, agencies, the growth was linearly tied to headcount. And so the moment you could decouple headcount and revenue, is when gross margins can achieve kind of the high levels that we're talking about. So, just to, make the math concrete for everyone. What is that? What does a gross margin increase kind of look like in absolute dollar terms?
Yeah. So let's say you have an agency that does $2 million in revenue, and you are at 45% gross margin. And let's say you want to increase, or you're trying to increase to 55 gross margin. So that 10% increase in gross margin gives you an additional $200,000 of capacity that you can then use to deploy for a variety of different areas.
Yeah, I mean, and that 10%, that could be the pricing, just like raising prices a little bit, tightening scope, like making some processes a little bit tighter. So yeah, it's all like, but then unlocking 200K, that could be salary for a salesperson, a marketing person, or something. So it's like you kind of start to see the possibilities of like, the margin impact on your business.
But yeah, maybe it's a good kind of segue into thinking about, what options do you have? You have gross margin. We talk about it creates optionality. Yeah, like how can you allocate that capital in the best way possible?
Yeah, and this is where I think most agency leaders, like once again, it's they don't kind of think about it in a proactive way. They look at it, in hindsight, and they go, "Oh, okay, like we did this. Maybe we should, do what we did last year." And just it's kind of that kind of reactive thinking. But if you put on that capital allocator hat, and and by that, we're talking about, how do you best deploy dollars, which will then yield more dollars in the future. You can start to think about some of these, things differently. So let's say, right, like you have, you achieve, 50% margin. So now you have 50% kind of left over, right? So if, on $1 million, you have, all of a sudden, 500K still left over to deploy in various ways. And obviously you want to keep some for profit and all that, but like, you still have some room. And I think, you're obviously going to have some kind of a baseline cost for some of these things, but then it's all beyond that. It's like, hey, how aggressive do you want to be? How much do you want to allocate, and what do you expect as an investment? So maybe we should dive into specifics. And I think one of the first things we can talk about is the sales and marketing piece, which this is something that we really obsess about across our agencies.
Yes. Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest buckets, beyond gross margin, and, we'll bucket it all kind of in SG&A. It's, thinking about how do you allocate funds against sales and marketing. I think if you look historically, there's going to be a baseline sales and marketing cost that any business has. There's definitely going to be some inbound leads that you need to process, or there's going to be some activities around expanding the accounts that you have already, or even baseline, you have a website, so you have to update your website. Like there's costs that you're going to incur, but kind of beyond that, you can set a baseline. You have a historical sales and marketing budget. Look at it, like what additional budget can you allocate to sales and marketing, and use it as a experiment of, all right, we're going to increase our budget by X amount, and we're going to do, all of these different, additional, experiments. We're going to hire a salesperson. We're going to go to these events. We're going to do, put more effort into different advertising or newsletters, and just really be explicit about the outcomes that you want from it. So you're going to spend $100,000. We want to yield $200,000, $300,000 or more in new business that comes in. And
revenue, right? Added revenue.
Revenue, yes. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And these are just general numbers. You can kind of do the math to say, all right, if you get an additional $200,000 revenue, and if your gross margin is 50%, then again, and you spend $100,000 to get there, it may be not enough, right? So you may need to shoot higher, so that your sales and marketing costs will pay for itself. But kind of the overarching thing here is, measure it and see if the investment that you're making in this additional sales and marketing will yield the results that you need.
Yeah, you're basically giving yourself room to experiment and find the things. And sometimes you're going to hit some really good kind of experiments that like yield fruit quickly. Other times it might be a slower burn over a longer period of time. But I think it is important to not be so kind of like obsessive about like immediate, input output of the results, but think about it as, long-term investments, because, as we know, like so many of these like biz dev kind of sales roles or marketing roles in agencies, they're on a really short leash. And so it's like, you give somebody 3 to 6 months to pay for themselves. A lot of times, like, most of the times they're going to be set up to fail. And first of all, they probably don't even have the right systems to be supported, which is a whole nother topic we could talk about. But like, at that point, what, like you go, oh, look, I spent a lot of money. I haven't got any results. I'm going to cut them. Right. But like, actually, you probably, should have thought about it as a longer time horizon, maybe 18 months, even a couple of years, and like, seeing it kind of compound over that time. But once again, like, none of this is possible without gross profits, because if you don't have that, it just, yeah, all of a sudden, like, you don't have enough dollars to play with.
Maybe it'd be helpful to just go into like what is sales and marketing, like what falls under the sales and marketing expenses.
Yeah.
Because we've seen a lot of different interpretations of this. So what we're talking about is, any of the labor against it. So any like specifically biz dev or salespeople in the organization whose sole focus is that. Anyone on a marketing team, like their salaries and their costs, that would definitely fall under that. Any hard costs for marketing. So let's say you're running ads and you have ad spend. So that would be marketing. If you're, spending money for events, sponsorships. Let's say you get a booth at a trade show. Like all those things would be hard costs. But you also might be experimenting with different software tools and any platforms, even like the CRM and how you might do outbound marketing. All of that would be kind of fall under that. But the piece that's often missing that it takes some time to think about is how much of your team's time. So let's say your founder, CEO, or your leadership team, how much time do they spend on sales and marketing? Because that could be a pretty significant percentage based on depending on the maturity of the business and what everyone does.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, like you could argue like the founder's baseline salary should be just, a lot of times if they're 100%, that's what they're doing. Yeah, it should just be under sales and marketing, and that would really increase the cost of sales and marketing expense. But yeah, I think a lot of times that's not quite, where you find it. And I mean, that's a whole other topic too, but like, yeah, I think that gives a bigger picture, but that's sales and marketing. Now let's just also talk about, G&A. So general and administrative expense. Expense, how do we kind of think about this, not just as overhead, but as a strategic investment?
Again, here, maybe let's start by defining what's included here. I think a lot of let's call it administrative expenses at an agency. So finance team members, finance software, HR, talent acquisition people, legal expenses or any accounting expenses, all of that kind of, whether it's contractors, vendors, employees, that would all be captured there. We would also see, any leadership or management team members that aren't specifically dedicated to delivery of work.
Or sales and marketing. Yeah.
Or sales and marketing. Their expense would be allocated here. Any kind of general software that the team, needs to incur to their work, any kind of hosting or anything like that, where it's all related to kind of infrastructure at the agency. Office rent is a big one where, depending on the agency, that could be a pretty sizable investment that needs to be made. And what we've seen more for, agencies that may have gone remote and no longer have an office, having like team retreats or offsites, that could be a pretty significant expense that replaces the office rent expense. On the G&A.
Yeah, and I think like to that point, for every one of these things, you can also think about it not just as like necessary fixed costs, but like these could be strategic investments, because even to your point of team retreats and offsites, like there are benefits to that. It could be for increasing sense of belonging for the team or whatever. It plays a role in retaining your employees, so that can be interesting. So we've talked about gross margin / profit. We've talked about sales and marketing. We've talked about general and administrative expenses. Now we come to how do we get to the EBITDA, right? What is good EBITDA? I think that's kind of, something that we get asked a lot is like, hey, what's the EBITDA we should be aiming for? And like, what is an acceptable EBITDA? So let's dive in.
Yeah. And we'll, you'll see there's a bunch of nuance here, but, as a benchmark across the Verra Holdings agencies, the average is around 25% for EBITDA. We've seen agencies that are lower. We've seen agencies that are higher. And some of it's related to revenue, right? If you have more revenue and you're a larger agency and you're doing, let's say, like 10 plus million in revenue, you could have a smaller EBITDA, but the absolute dollar of that EBITDA could be large. Or if you're a smaller agency, then you kind of need a higher EBITDA because the absolute dollars are so small. So I think it really, I think it has to do with the relationship between the gross margin and the EBITDA also,
Yeah.
right? But you can't look at it in a silo of, what is the EBITDA? Is it good or not?
Yeah. I mean, this goes back to like the margin and profit side of things because it's like basically, for the gross. So EBITDA, you can think about it as like EBITDA, there's EBITDA percentage and then there's EBITDA, just like the absolute number. And, at the end of the day, like, yeah, I think there is kind of a line at which, and I think we generally go, hey, like 15% is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the line you want to draw. Like we definitely want to be north of that. But just, and there's some caveats to that, but like, which we'll get into, but like, the thing is, yeah, the scale and the absolute dollar amounts matter.
Right. So yeah, let's talk about when high EBITDA can be a red flag. And when we think about high, we're thinking, 35% plus. And the first thing that calls out to us when EBITDAs are that high, it could mean that they're under investing in sales and marketing and or other areas that could support in their future growth.
Yeah, I mean, so this just kind of reminds me because like like just looking at so every week we're reviewing agency P&Ls, right, that come in for M&A, and like just looking at a few of them over the last week, even like there are a lot of agencies that are reporting 50 plus 60% EBITDA, and
Yeah.
like as a snapshot, it's like it's flashy number because you're like, whoa, cool. Like, they're doing 4 million in revenue, but like, they're doing 2+ million in EBITDA. Wow. This is like a very profitable agency. But then, you take a step back and then you look at their growth over the last 3 years and you realize they're pretty flat or declining. And so in terms of the revenue, the top line. And so, yeah, that just like goes to show it's like, hey, they built something profitable, but like they did not invest in any growth.
Yeah. And I guess to that point is to look at how much they spend on growth. In the case that could be okay is actually if they have a really high gross margin. So let's say it's, 70, 80%, and they still invested, 20, 30% of that for SG&A, and their EBITDA ends up north of 35%. Maybe that scenario is okay. Like it's not like a lack of investment there. But on the flip side, let's say you have 40% gross margin and 35% EBIT, and you've only spent 5% on all of SG&A, like that could signal a flag of underinvestment.
Yeah. No, and usually, like, I think that rings very true because, like, some of these agencies that we've seen with the flat growth, it's like when they're reporting 60% EBITDA, like their gross margin is probably right around there as well. It's like around like 58% gross margin. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I guess, if we think about, what is the flag? Like, why are we, what do we look at is, there might be an under investment in biz devs, dedicated resources or processes around that. So it might be very like founder led business development and marketing for that matter. So it can be minimal marketing at all. Like they're not investing in, all the activities to get awareness. And, from that, it could be very founder driven relationship. So all the leads coming in are just from, the founder's, personal network. So there isn't a lot of system built out for growth. And then ultimately, the pipeline isn't that strong. If it's, it could be very sporadic where leads come in. It could be just people, referrals from relationships, and we'll see like not a lot of like organic leads come in because there's not a lot of awareness of the agency. So there's just a lot of gaps where, if you don't invest there, you could, temporarily have a high EBITDA number. But, it is, a warning sign for us.
All right. Actually, so this is fun. One of the things in our kind of many conversations with agency leaders, right, is like this statement of like, especially when you look at their P&L and, profits are, let's say, sub 10%, even break even, and in some cases, even negative.
Yeah.
The thing that we often hear is, that was a year that we invested in growth. And we're here to point out like a lot, like I'd say like 9 out of 10 times probably, it's like a myth, right? This kind of we invested in growth. So let's dive into why that might be.
Yeah, so when we see that or hear that, we always look at the gross margin, right? Because the gross margin should tell a story of, usually what we see is gross margins have slipped, and from there, if your gross margin is low and your SG&A is a fixed expense or you're spending the same amount, that's easily how you can get to a low EBITDA number. And, if you dig into why gross margin slipped, it's all the things we talked about where, maybe their pricing power went down and they've been a little bit less disciplined. So they're discounting and trying to win work at lower budgets without really, changing how they're doing scoping or staffing, and just not very, managed very well. And there's just not room, like when your gross margins are low, when you have low utilizations, like there's not a lot of room to fund growth. So any growth that, let's say they did invest in growth, like that is, taking them from a low gross margin to, close to break even or negative as a business.
Yeah. So let's illustrate for folks, because like I think we get asked this so much. It's kind of like, hey, what is the right kind of profile? Like what's the discipline kind of right kind of profile for an agency in terms of percentages down the stack, the kind of margin stack, let's say. So maybe just go through like rule of thumb, and then obviously depending on the situation you kind of modify here and there. But yeah, let's share this, because I think this is like something we get asked multiple times every week.
Yeah. So let's say 50+% as a gross margin target, 15 to 20% for sales and marketing, 5 to 10% for other G&A expenses, to land at around 20 to 30% EBIT. I think like that's like a comfortable, healthy mix for the business.
Yeah, and really like this, obviously, it gets a little bit tougher when you're smaller. So at $1 million, let's say, right, like you probably will have have higher gross margins. And then, but like you could argue that the founder is wearing many hats, so they're also in many ways like they're getting paid to do the work, so they're kind of in the cost of delivery, and then they're also wearing the sales and marketing hats, and so you kind of like getting some degree of discount there. But then it's really when you get to 2, 3, 4, 5 million plus that these numbers, you definitely want to kind of hew closely and obviously try to do better on the gross margin side.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think that's it. We covered a lot of ground here. What are your takeaways for this?
Yeah, I think hopefully this message came across that gross margin and high gross margin creates kind of freedom and optionality in your business. And from there, you can make very intentional allocation decisions after you have that margin, so you can decide how that money is spent. And in specific, where we usually find underinvestment is sales and marketing. So really thinking about how you can be intentional, how you can measure the results, and really be clear about what the outcomes are for that. Also with a reasonable time horizon for measurement. Taking a look at G&A, really using that strategically. Don't just think of it as overhead that needs to happen, but be deliberate about where your money is going there. And finally, margin is important. If you just have margin growth without,
what do you mean revenue growth?
Specifically, revenue growth without, I'll say specifically gross margin integrity. It's really just erosion. Like there's something wrong with the system that you need to fix. Because you could have high growth revenue, declining gross margin, fixed SG&A, and your EBIT could be declining even though your revenue is growing. So I would say really focus on gross margin.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully we've beat this over your heads enough times today. So yeah, definitely mind your gross margins. And until next time, thanks for listening.
Thanks.